Hi, everybody. I'm John here. Welcome. Good evening, members, friends, and guests. Welcome to the Battle of Homestead Foundation's 2022 program series. I'm John Hare, Battle Homestead Board President. Tonight, we'll again dig deep in the fertile soil of American social and industrial history. We'll cover a period when our grandparents and their parents lived and worked. We'll talk about how this history affects us all and our future. Our focus is the post-World War I era, some 100 years ago, specifically the 1920s, a time of vibrant social ferment, left and right, in the U.S. Significantly, we'll also discuss how unknown history can be unearthed years later.
Yuck.
So historian Lou Martin and former coal miner, teacher, and social activist Kipp Dawson will be our guides. Kipp will introduce us to her grandfather, Herman Martius, whose tragic death spurred a wealth of ancestor research. We'll also meet two remarkable student researchers who have built the emerging story as a model people's history resource. Following discussion with our guests, there will be a question and answer period. Everyone, please read out your questions to the speakers and post them on the chat. We won't be able to get to them all, but we'll do our best in the time allotted. Let me briefly tell you about the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Our founders were inspired by a dramatic labor conflict, the 1892 Battle of Homestead. The nation's eyes back then were on this thriving industrial town 12 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. The strong union, the Amalgamated, had built powerful alliances within the workforce, the community, and the region. They knew they had to defend their labor contract and its high compensation and work standards. Their employer, the Carnegie Steel Company, a monopoly empire controlled by Andrew Carnegie and his henchman, Henry Clay Frick, was determined to cut wages and break the union. When the contract expired, Frick built an 8-foot-high wall around the mill, locked out the workers, and launched plans to import scab labor. An epic struggle ensued, which, despite extraordinary resilience and militance by the workers and their allies, ultimately resulted in defeat for the Union. That's because 8,000 state militia were sent in by the governor to occupy the mill and protect scab labor, and ultimately to usher in an era of U.S. labor relations, a dark era where wages and hours decreased, hours increased, wages decreased, and working conditions got worse. There are many sub-stories and revelations within the epic of the Battle of Homestead, far too many to relate tonight. The more we dig deeper and learn, we discover and celebrate the seeds of hope in that resilient workers and community struggle. What are seeds of hope? A story or discovery that another world is possible. The mission of Battle of Homestead Foundation is to grow these seeds of hope by promoting a people's history, but also we work to empower today's workforce and build strategies for a future that benefits all working families in our nation. Our goal is to develop a regional center and institute for labor history and the future of work. 2 years ago, about this time, the COVID pandemic forced us to change how we do this mission. Our public panels, historical commemorations, concerts, and drama are now presented online only. Publicity is generated with partners through social media. Even today, in the third year of COVID, the threat remains uncertain. Actually, we've discovered new opportunities to reach out, educate, fundraise, and organize. Today, the seeds of hope still sprout anew, even as our country faces major social, economic, and political crises. I need only mention the tragic racially motivated massacre of innocent shoppers in Buffalo last week to amplify this crisis. But crisis can also mean opportunity. Since November 3rd, 2020, we can begin to see the light. We take heart and recognize the tremendous organizing by grassroots groups throughout the nation, many women-led, often in coalition with organized labor. This heroic effort was the engine that expanded the electorate, giving voice to millions of average working people. Thus was propelled the election defeat of a mendacious anti-democratic president and his morally bankrupt enablers. But the hard-won progress is by no means assured to continue. Tonight, we again celebrate creative grassroots workplace organizing, alliance building, and people's history making. We're optimistic about our mission as we see the growth of power for working women and men in their communities. So we say, come join us. More about our exciting upcoming programs in the wrap-up tonight. Now, I'm delighted to give the mic to Kipp Dawson, our own labor hero. Kipp walked 50 miles in 3 days in West Virginia last fall with the United Mine Workers contingent, honoring and commemorating the striking miners fighting for their union in the 1921 Battle of Blair Mountain. What a walk, Kim, and what a wonderful activist you are. Kim Dawson.
Thank you so much, John. And it was my honor to make that walk. Along with Lou Martin, we were in West Virginia celebrating the Centennial of the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is actually very relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight, because it was the same period of time that we're looking at now, a time when miners were and their families were being shot and killed in attempts just to form a union, but they persevered. And that's kind of the soul of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I want to thank very much the Battle of Homestead Foundation for sponsoring this event tonight. Each of the panelists who are here tonight and every single person who's gathered with us tonight for being a part of the finding and preserving and sharing our history from below, which is what this is all about. We're going to begin tonight with a family story. It happens to be my family's, but it also belongs to you, to each of you. Like many such stories, this one was whispered from generation to generation. Like many, there were silences which sparked curiosities as the story was partly told. My cousin Joanna, who I see is with us here tonight, and I have always wanted to learn about the missing pieces. So individually, each of us did our exploration and probing, and we have come together over the last several decades to share the process of trying to learn. We'll begin where I did, with the story as my mom told it to me, into a tape recorder, as she and I talked and recorded an oral history that she was willing to share in the 1980s. My mom's mom, Brocha Landau, had been born in 1895 in Lodz, Poland. Now, Lodz and Poland, along with Ukraine and other parts of Western Russia, were part of what was called the Pale, which was the only place that Jews were allowed to live at that time in the vast Russian Empire, and where the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews from the world lived at that time. By 1914, when she was 19 years old, my grandmother, Brocha, had married Herschel Mortalis, and their first daughter, Miriam, had already been born. Miriam is the mother of my cousin Joanna. We call her Millie in our family. As my mom put it, quote, this is a quote from what she told me back then, they left as soon as they could. They left the Pale as soon as they could after World War I broke out to avoid the draft, which was particularly onerous to Jews who already were suffering from the pogroms and the deep anti-Semitism that was everywhere in the Pale and in Eastern Europe at that time. Along with most of the emigres who left, their destination was the USA. My mom said that was because, and this is a quote from my mom, because it was at that time the country seen as a place of refuge. It was the only democracy in the world that they knew of besides England, and you couldn't avoid World War I by going to England, so they came here. This little family of three traveled for 2 years to get to the United States. They went east across Russia and Siberia. My mom learned from her sister, Millie, that as exiles, they scrambled for shelter and food, traveling east across Russia and Siberia, eventually making it to Japan, where they boarded the ship across the Pacific. I learned that they arrived in Seattle on April 7th, 1916. There, their names were changed. Brocha became Beatrice, Herschel became Herman, Miriam remained Miriam, and their last name was changed to Martius. This was done at immigration. From Seattle, they traveled across the United States and eventually made it to Erie, Pennsylvania. Why Erie, you might ask? The answer that I learned from my mom was because it was there that they found a home among what were called landsmen, Landsmen. It's a Yiddish word meaning other people who come from the same part of the world that you do, speak the same languages, have had, and in their case, had the same kinds of dangerous journeys in order to be able to get to where they were, and who together were building a new life. Herman Martius became the proprietor of what was then called a dry goods shop, and Beatrice soon gave birth to their second child, their daughter Ruth, whose son Mark is with us tonight. Like many of their sister and brother emigres, the Martiuses had been long used to looking out for one another in ways that brought them into solidarity with others who faced discrimination and repression. That began with other Jews in the area in which they came from, but it expanded very quickly to, when they came to the United States, their sense of solidarity to Black people who were then under the rule in the South, were under the torment in the South and also in the North of the lynchings that were being massively done by Ku Klux Klan and other organizations. The solidarity that my grandparents joined in with the rest of their landsmen with extended also very strongly at that time to striking coal miners who were not only in West Virginia, but also in Pennsylvania, were being shot down simply for the absolutely necessary job of forming a union to protect them and their families from the violence of the coal operators. My grandparents were among those who were in Erie and other places in the country who were drawn into raising money and giving support to others who were struggling against the same kinds of things that they were. And they were also, the year after they arrived in the United States, inspired by the Russian Revolution against the Tsar in 1917. In fact, Herschel, who was now Herman, became the local treasurer of Friends of the Soviet Union. We'll talk more about that later. Life for the Martiuses was rich and full, not rich financially, but rich in that they were among people who, like them, found community.
I can't talk now until after 6. Is that okay? All right. And I'm probably not going to go now until Saturday.
I'm sorry. I think we're having some
I'll call
other.
you back after this.
There's someone who needs to mute their microphone, please. My grandparents were part of the social justice struggles, which those in power in the country were working at that time to suppress, including by gathering up people like them and sending them back to the countries that they had come from or imprisoning them. Violence against Jews, against immigrants, against workers was widespread at that time, including here in Pennsylvania. This was the scene in which Herman Martius was murdered. On April 5th, 1922, 100 years ago, as he sat in the back of his dry goods store on 18th Street in Erie, someone took some kind of sharp weapon to the back of his head and with 2 blows left him mortally wounded lying on the floor of his shop. His wife, my grandmother, and the children, Millie and Ruth, were returned from a visit to my grandmother's sister, Yacha, in New York, to screaming headlines and police investigations. which we will be talking more about as the panel goes on. Now, this story could have died there, but neither my cousin nor Joanna or I felt that we were going to let it die. As we continued our search into what happened, I also told this story to my friend, Professor Lou Martin at Chatham University, who also thought it needed to be explored. His initiatives, his teaching, his leadership led him to inspire students to do the research and the history and materials which they came up with, which they are going to be sharing with you tonight. They were engaged in bringing together, preserving, and sharing people's history from below. And it is now my pleasure to turn the mic over to Professor Lou Martin.
Thanks, Kipp. I am a history professor at Chatham. My research focuses on labor history, and I teach U.S. history courses, including one on oral history, as well as another titled Digital Local History. And I was offering that class in the spring of 2019. I met Kipp doing an oral history. I was working on a project interviewing former coal miners. And that's how I met her. And then when she retired from teaching, she mentioned she wanted to preserve parts of her family's history, including the death of Herman Martius and the experiences of her grandmother, Beatrice. I was lucky that two of our very best students signed up for the class that spring, Zoe Levine and Claire Rhodey. Zoe graduated from Chatham in 2021. She majored in history and political science, and she grew up in the Jewish community in Erie and is now a social justice fellow with Hillel at Oberlin. Claire Rhodey majored in history and creative writing, and she is now, and she graduated, I believe, in 2019. Claire can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but she's now pursuing a master's of information science at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Early on in doing the project, Kipp met with us and talked to us about what she had learned from being passed down through the generations. And the students decided on a website that was a timeline that could show the events. And we also decided to look at different historical contexts of these Jewish immigrants who were also radical activists living in Western Pennsylvania in Erie. We each chose a historical context to explore. And I'm going to share my screen with the website, but we're also going to share the link to the website so that people can see it. So hopefully you can see the headline from the Erie Daily News, as I recall. And the students wrote everything that you see here, and they also have excerpts of an interview that they did with Kipp. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Zoe to talk about her experiences. I'm going to stop sharing, but as Zoe talks, I'll share again to show you what she's referring to.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Martin. And thank you, everyone, for allowing me to be here tonight. Being able to take part in this research was really just the perfect culmination of so many interests I held and included parts of my own identity. I grew up Jewish in Erie, Pennsylvania. I really focused on studying the early 20th century during my undergrad, and I was definitely interested in how American and European society reacted to communism and socialism. So when I was approached by Dr. Martin to partake in this project, I was really excited. Hearing Kipp's story and the motivation and passion behind why she had reached out about the research was also a large part in why I decided to participate. It was also my first time being able to take research I was working on and have it published in a public way through our Timeline site. For my part of the research, I focused on the Jewish experience in Western Pennsylvania and analyzed how that contributed to Herman Martius's identity and death. As Kipp discussed, Herman and Beatrice Martius and their family were part of a wave of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who made their way to Western Pennsylvania in the early 1900s, who were immigrating to try to evade getting drafted for the army and to evade pogroms and anti-Semitism. The mix of xenophobia and anti-Semitism played into the way Jewish immigrants were perceived by their communities. Erie happened to be the third largest Jewish community at the time in Western Pennsylvania, speaking to what Kipp mentioned before. And one synagogue there, Temple Anshe Hesed, was the main synagogue where liberal and leftist Jews were connected to. And just taking a step back, this is the same synagogue that I grew up in, had my bat mitzvah in, and was confirmed in. So this just shows how aspects of this research ended up feeling really personal to me. It was also really interesting to be able to look at how the prevalence of fraternal organizations in the Jewish immigrant community mirrored Herman Martius' own connection to radical organizations in Erie. Violence in the United States, especially towards Jews, was high at this time and existed in Erie. A lot of this happened due to the ostracization of American Jews by Gentile elites, including forcing Americanization onto Jewish immigrants. Physical violence was heightened against Jews, specifically Jewish immigrants. Although we weren't there to solve the murder of Herman Martius, we can assume that the increase of anti-Semitism, nationalism, and anti-socialism could have possibly caused this targeted attack. And I remember when we had kind of gotten to the end of our research and we were putting together this timeline site that I felt like a detective. It was pretty straightforward to me that all of these parts of what made up American attitudes in society at the time were what ultimately led to Herman Martius' murder. And being able to reflect on this in relation to what happens today was really informative to me as a college student. While I was learning all this throughout my research, I was also learning how to partake in creating digital history through our timeline website that Dr. Martin has shown you. I was still in my sophomore year of college when I began this research, so I was very new to the process, and I did not have the knowledge of digital platforms that both Claire and Dr. Martin had. I was very fortunate to be able to work with both of them and learn through them in the process. I believe it is incredibly important to digitize history, especially personal stories, so that they can be accessible to the general public for generations to come. Taking all this research I had done, it was also really fascinating to be able to compare it to what Dr. Martin and Claire were finding. And being able to hear firsthand from Kipp her family's history and stories regarding Herman Martius and Beatrice Martius also really informed me about the importance of social and familial histories. I remember we had gotten a study room in the library on campus to conduct the oral history interview of Kipp. And it was a really great experience, especially being able to work alongside Claire. We had hooked up a microphone to my laptop to record the interview. I also remember at the time thinking, oh, I hope we're asking the right questions, and I hope this technology is working, because some of what Kipp was sharing was just so informative and really paralleled what I had found in my research about Jewish identity, specifically Eastern European Jewish immigrant identity. One thing that really stuck with me that Kipp shared, which I think she'll probably share again later today, is that her mother said how history is like a corkscrew, as history does repeat itself. And it can seem that we are moving backward, but we are still moving forward, kind of in this like upward spiral. And that's really stuck with me. I still tell my students that today all the time. And I learned so much through Kipp. And I just wanted to thank her again for pulling this group together and allowing me to be part of it. My pleasure now to turn it over to Claire.
Thank you, Zoe. And thank you, everybody, for being here. So like Dr. Martin said, when I got involved in his class in this project, it was my last semester as an undergrad. And to be honest with you, I was thoroughly done with school. And I was looking for something that would catch my interest and something that felt like it mattered. So I think I was truly lucky to meet Kipp at that time in my life, because there was nothing that I had stuck with in the way she did, trying to find the truth behind what happened to her grandfather. I admired her a lot for it then, and I still do now. And at first, when I heard about this project, it felt Herculean, and I had the easy third of it. I was researching socialist movements at the time, focusing particularly on the group that Herman Martius was a part of course, the Friends of Socialist Russia. So I got to spend my time reading reports from the Pittsburgh Bureau of Investigation, which was part of the precursor network to the FBI. Although I'm sorry to say that the Friends were rarely mentioned at all, because they weren't large enough or considered dangerous enough to attract any particular attention. They spent most of their time fundraising for famine relief for people back home in Russia. and because the agent the Bureau sent couldn't speak Russian or Polish. So that really put a damper on eavesdropping on their meetings. So Herman Martius was the treasurer of the Erie branch of the Friends, and this was suggested at the time as a reason for his murder. He may have had relief funds at the store, which was an early theory when police believed robbers may have been responsible. And then this was later twisted to be a motivation for his fellow radicals instead. At the time, Pittsburgh was still the Steel City. There was a ton of industry there and consequently a ton of unions. So they were seeing a lot of the early effects of what would later be the Red Scare, or be known as the Red Scare. And so there were rising tensions, and a lot of members of groups were turning on each other and reporting on each other. There were a lot of Bureau of Investigation agents who were infiltrating groups, and it was a very tense time to be a radical. But despite all of this, and despite the work that Kipp has done throughout her life, it still really remains a mystery exactly what happened. There are the official theories. I'll leave it up to your own decision or judgment if you think those are accurate. And towards the end of the semester, like Zoe said, we interviewed Kipp. And I went back to my old journal to find what I'd said about the experience, and to my chagrin, it was very little. I'd said, we just finished short oral history with Kipp, and even though I'm a bit exhausted and washed out, it was almost an hour. I'm glad we did it. So that was very descriptive from the girl who kept this monster as a journal. But it's true, honestly. It was an exhausting project, and I'm so glad, even 3 years on, that we did it. And that I got to have this experience with Kipp, with Dr. Martin, and with Zoe. And as a side note, at the same time, Kipp and I were taking a writing class at the different writing classes, same place, different floors. I ran into her a lot, and she shared some of her writing with me then, and she has since. And if you ever have the chance to read it, I really recommend it, because as you can tell, she has a way with words. And okay, I'm going to get to some of the more practical parts of the digital history project, which is for the website that you saw, we went with Satori because we wanted a free platform that would allow us to construct a timeline. While we could have paid monthly or yearly for access, we wanted to avoid that because, you know, sometimes you change credit cards and forget to pay. You just don't want digital rot with a project like this. We wanted this to be up for people to access for as long as we could have it. We also have the audio backed up in a Google Drive account, just in case we ever need access to it or somebody needs to reconstruct the project. And if you're trying to preserve your own history project, after this experience, I would recommend making sure that more than one person has access to your storage and that your data is backed up in more than one place. And the Wayback Machine is a great way to save your website once it's up. Okay. And all of this aside, I just want to say again that I was really lucky to work on this project as I did and with the people that I did. Kipp and so many other people in the Zoom room tonight have kept her grandfather's memory alive. And while I really wish she didn't need to under these circumstances, an event like this where we can all learn about the history surrounding his life and death is amazing. And Dr. Martin and Zoe were both grounding forces and pushed this project to be much more than just a timeline on the website. It became a living, breathing thing. And if this inspires you at all, I wish you luck with your own digital local history project. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Martin.
Thanks, Claire. And Claire is, as I recall, the person who found Satori for us. I think she looked at several platforms and finally decided on this one, and it has some pluses and minuses, but it was great for our purposes and preserving the story. The historical context that I explored was the resurgence of right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism after World War I. And historians have argued that this was in part a response to industrialization, a wave of immigration, rapid changes, and really the spread of propaganda, the fear and hatred that was spread through propaganda. Henry Ford bought the Dearborn Independent, for example, Michigan newspaper, and began publishing anti-Semitic screeds and conspiracy theories that would fuel hatred. He was one of many. Historian John Craig has written a thorough and insightful history of the Ku Klux Klan in Western Pennsylvania at this time, and it was very helpful. In June 1921, the Klan sent a recruiter to Pittsburgh. This was a year before Martius's death. And in turn, he sent somebody to Erie. And that recruiter reportedly left in February 1922, 2 months before the murder, but he had been actively recruiting for several months. In April 1922, the month that Martius was murdered, the Klan made a public showing in Western Pennsylvania with a series of cross burnings. I also did some research into some primary sources, a publication called Jewish Criterion, local Pittsburgh newspapers, and there's a digital archive of the Pennsylvania State Police records on the Ku Klux Klan at the time. It's a very unwieldy database. I couldn't find information specific to Erie. Much like Claire, we sort of, we didn't do an exhaustive search, but the records on Erie itself weren't really jumping out at us. And I've always tried to entice my wife into an Erie, Pennsylvania vacation. I even talked about it in that semester, and maybe this is the year. But because I do think there are local archives that might be helpful in this regard. Regardless, it's clear from what we found out that there was a lot of right-wing extremism in and around Erie, Pennsylvania at that time. And it made it a dangerous place for Beatrice and Herman. It also made it a place where the authorities weren't really on their side, as we'll hear from Kipp. I'll say that it was a great experience to work with Zoe and Claire, and the secret to, I think, having a great course is inviting Kipp Dawson to be an important part of it, because this was one of the most successful courses I've taught. And I think that Kipp is a fantastic educator, and so she really was able to work with us in a way that made this project so meaningful to us still to this day. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kipp.
I think this project brought out the best in all of us, because we were doing something that I think tingles one's soul. We were going back in time and finding people like ourselves who had found themselves in situations that we couldn't otherwise have imagined, but with which they were dealing together collectively in ways that were inspiring, even in the midst of some horrors. And it was my honor and pleasure to work with Lou Martin and with Claire and Zoe on this project. And I want to thank them. And I can see, and I'm sure my cousins can also, that my grandparents would have felt a lot of joy in hearing this tonight. And thank you very much, all three of you, for setting the atmosphere in which my grandmother and the family and the people of Erie were making their way forward 100 years ago. That May, in 1922, Beatrice Martius celebrated her 27th birthday. She was and she celebrated it in a very hard situation, a newly widowed mother of two, a Jew, a recent immigrant who was not yet a U.S. citizen, in a country where people like her, were getting deported and murdered. She had never talked about how she made it through those times. But we know some of the circumstances that she had to deal with, as the panelists have been telling us. As my mother said when we talked on tape, this is a quote from my mom, the Palmer raids had swept through communities everywhere, scooping up immigrants and communists into mass deportations. People like your grandmother, she said to me, and her husband and workers striking for unions were being beat up and jailed. But far from stopping those attackers, in many cases, the police and the government were the attackers. They had no refuge in going to the police or the government for help, as we will see. In Erie, after the murder, as the newspapers that you see bits of here in the website reported day after day, the big headlines about the murder, and they reported that the police were stumbling through an investigation of my grandmother's husband's murder. According to the newspaper stories, which stayed in big banner headlines for days, the police went from suspecting a burglary to then accusing my grandmother and a male friend of the family of having an affair and plotting the murder for insurance money. OMG. Can you imagine? The family friend who was accused actually was arrested. He was interrogated. Then he was let loose, exonerated. Big headlines for the arrest, tiny print for his exoneration. My grandmother herself, for days, was interrogated for hours by the police. That made headlines too. Suspected of having an affair and having her husband killed. Her exoneration was in tiny print the following days when she was exonerated. The papers reported that then the headlines reported that the authorities suspected that comrades of the Martiuses had killed him, that they had gotten into an argument and the Reds had killed him. Communists had killed one of their own. And then they said, well, that's not really true either. And the story dropped. The story dropped for a reason, though, I think. My grandmother reported to us, to her children, that she went to the mayor to plead the officials to find out who had killed her husband. And here's how my mom described to me what she had learned from her mother. My mom said, the mayor leaned over his desk and said to your grandmother, if you were my own daughter, I would tell you the same thing. It is hopeless to find the criminal. The best thing for you and your children would be to sell your store and get out of here because it isn't safe for you here. The end. Behind the scenes, we learned what may have inspired that comment from the mayor. I found this information deep down in an April 8th, 1922 newspaper article. This is a quote from that article. It was learned yesterday that while the police were working on the theory of robbery or the eternal triangle, an undercover federal agent slipped into the city quietly, and he has been making investigations along his own lines. Not because the federal government isn't interested directly in the killing of Martius, as that was an offense against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but to learn to what extent the Reds were implicated in this crime and just how widespread is the apparent difficulty between factions of the radical forces in this vicinity. The newspaper went on to say, it's expected that this federal agent soon will place in the hands of the local authorities evidence that may result in the arrest of the party or parties guilty of the foul murder on West 18th Street. Of course, there was no such report, at least not to the officials in Erie, and certainly not to my grandmother. We can make an educated guess that this undercover agent had come to Erie as part of the then new operation that J. Edgar Hoover was leading as the first exuberant director of the then new Federal Bureau of Investigation. His self-defined mission was, as he put it, developing files on and acting against subversives. In a history of the FBI by Tim Weiner, we learn that from 1919 on, Hoover, and this is a quote from the book, planned a nationwide dragnet of mass arrests to round up subversives, round up communists, round up Russian aliens, as if he were quarantining carriers of typhoid. On January 1st, 1920, he had sent out orders leading to the arrests of 6,000 people like my grandparents. This was part of the atmosphere that my grandmother faced. Going to the police for help when the biggest police agency in the country was part of the problem? It wasn't going to work. Anti-Semitism also was storming the country then, as Lou Martin was saying. As we have learned tonight, the 250,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan in Pennsylvania were both anti-Catholic and virulently anti-Jewish. My grandmother had witnessed in her homeland what anti-Semitism could mean for people like her, even before the Nazis took power. This was the atmosphere in which she was existing as a young widow with 2 children following the murder of her husband. But that was only half of the atmosphere. And I hope that this will help to answer a couple of the questions in the chat, because there really is a big but. And Claire referred to this too. There was another side to what my grandmother faced back then, 100 years ago. She was part of a community that had been built on solidarity, a community of people who were alive and living where they were because others had helped them escape horrors and make big and dangerous trips that brought them there. A community which knew firsthand what solidarity was all about. And this community surrounded and supported my grandmother and her daughters. Far from going into hiding in the face of the xenophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, union busing around them, they had been empowered by opposite experiences. As I mentioned before, 18 months after the Martius family arrived in Erie, they and their community experienced, as my mom put it, the wave of joy that swept over the whole Russian emigre community with the news that people like them back home in Russia had overthrown the Tsarist government and were taking power away from the government that had been so repressive of them. Workers and peasants had successfully replaced the Tsar's government with one of their own. While some of the immigrants discussed going back to live in a freed Russia, many, including my grandparents, saw things the way that the Big Bill Haywood put it. He was a leader of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. He was in jail for opposing World War I. When he heard of the revolution's victory in Russia, he said, "We have lived to see the breaking of the glorious Red Dawn. The world revolution is born." Emma Goldman put it this way, "I have set my face toward the red glow on the social horizon. After all, that is the only real and worthwhile love." There was excitement about that in the Jewish community in Erie and in many other parts of the world. It was that excitement and that enthusiasm, that comradeship, that solidarity that surrounded my grandmother with support when her husband was killed. On April 7th, the community gathered at the Jewish cemetery in Erie. And my mom says, as my mom told me about it, to the slow movement of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, the Jewish community gathered to give a red funeral to their comrade Herman Martius as they laid his body in the ground. The community gave my grandmother and my aunts Millie and Ruth shelter and love and helped them make their way to a safer home in Los Angeles. I don't know details, but I do know that they made that long journey with the help of what we in Teen Screen call upstanders, people whose solidarity provided them with shelter and sustenance on the journey. And they were received into a similar community in Los Angeles, where my mom was born into the warmth of solidarity and a family determined to continue it. Yiddish theater and socialism, determination and love. In a sense, I can tell you much of this story because I am a product of this history. I was able to visit Herman Martius's grave and obtain many of the documents on which our story tonight is based because of union solidarity. In 1990, the United Electrical Workers were working to organize plastics workers in Erie. At that time, I was an underground coal miner in Washington County, just south of Pittsburgh, active in my local of the United Mine Workers of America. When UE, the United Electrical Workers, put out a call asking for solidarity and support for their organizing drive in Erie, my United Mine Workers local responded by getting me excused from the mine for a week on union business to join the Erie effort. While I was in Erie, I did work on the organizing drive and learned a lot from UE, who are good organizers. But I also spent off time in the library and in public offices, going through records and making copies of, like, the newspaper articles that you saw here and that are on the website and other public documents. And I contacted Zoe's Jewish congregation. I didn't know Zoe then yet. That congregation helped me get a key to the cemetery in which Herman Martius had been buried and where that ceremony had taken place. With a friend I had made among the union activists, we unlocked the gate and walked into a scene we both marveled at. It was quiet, but not quiet. We looked at one another in wonder as we had no difficulty finding the gravesite. Perhaps it was shared imagination, but we also shared with one another afterward how we felt we were carried on a wave of solidarity and support as we looked at the gravestone. As I wrote in my own journal, like you, Claire, I've kept a journal and I'm grateful to it. On July 13th, 1990, in my entry there, I wrote, among other things, "It's a simple tombstone, but so clear it looks new." It says, Herman Martius, innocently killed April 7, 1922. April 7th was actually the burial date, and Jews bury their dead very quickly after they are killed. Standing and kneeling beside that grave, and this is back to my journal again, standing and kneeling beside it and looking behind me to a still wide open plot of grass, I could feel the presence of the mourners, his comrades and friends, and my grandmother, who the paper reports had to be escorted away from the services when she broke down. That's the end of my journal entry. But I knew that my grandmother was escorted. Through all of this, with and supported by the solidarity which had helped her to get to the United States and was able to sustain her through the rest of her life as she continued to give it back. She played it forward till the time that she died. So as we tell her story as part of our own tonight, we carry it forward. The presenters tonight have handed it to us and to the world, and we, all of us, we carry the solidarity forward. And goodness knows, in times like these, this is so incredibly needed. And it is my honor to pass the mic back over to Zoe, who is going to talk about that.
Thank you, Kipp. As Kipp was saying, it is so important to understand the historical and societal ties that lead to the violence and white supremacy we saw this past Saturday in Buffalo, when a white supremacist participated in an act of racially motivated violence, resulting in the death of 10 Black Americans. I ask of us to have a 10-second moment of silence for each of the lives lost now. In the aftermath of horrific attacks that include violence, such as this one, it may seem hard to know what next steps we can take to address the gravity of it all. Many of my students and those within my generation have been connected to acts of violence for our entire lives, and more recently through acts of violence, including Tree of Life and school shootings. I work with students to engage in social justice, advocacy, and activism within a Jewish framework. We have just begun to debrief around Buffalo, but we've had these conversations regarding white supremacy, gun violence, and the history of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the academic year, and most of us have had these conversations for the majority of our lives. We work hard to address the systematic and societal causes for the issues we face today in the United States through education, volunteering, and organizing. As we see with Herman Martius' story, anti-Semitism, anti-radicalism, and xenophobia are nothing new. Identity-based violence is something that has existed for the entirety of American history. But those who have fought against it have also existed for the entirety of American history. I find consolation in the work I do, seeing students ready to tackle these issues head on, and I hope that provides you all hope as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Kipp. At this time, before we get into discussion, I wanted to open the floor to any of Kipp's family members or descendants of Herman Martius who would like to either say something or ask a question. And so if you want to unmute yourself, if you're one of Kipp's family members or Herman's descendants, please do so now.
I'll pipe in while other people are considering if they will. I'm Joanna, whom Kipp mentioned already. I just want to thank you all for doing this and say how very meaningful it is to me, as well as I'm sure to so many other people.
Thank you, Joanna. Any other family members or descendants want to say something?
I'm not sure if you can hear me. This is Mark Morose. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, something's wrong with the camera, so I'll just speak. But I also first want to express my love to my family, to Joanna, Kipp, and all of the members. It's been an interesting journey for me in my life, if I can be very personal about this, and I apologize for not being able to have you see me. But I live in Los Angeles. My mother was Ruth, who was in some of the pictures that you've seen and was present at the event of, or was alive when they came home to the death of my grandfather. And my mother took a parallel but yet a difficult path along compared with her sister, who is Joanna's mom. And there was a bit of a separation going on between parts of my family for a while. But over time, that came back together again. I approached parts of my family that I honestly didn't know. And now we're much more of a solid internet group that reaches from coast to coast and probably to different countries. We found in our solidarity that we feel today more love now because we reached back in the past. All the work that Kim and Joanna have been doing, and so much thanks to Zoe and Claire for helping out so much. But the point I'm only making is that by digging into our past and just knowing a bit, finding out more, asking each other questions, not being afraid, putting in some legwork, that we've all been able to share now a common history that we actually are quite proud of, even though it comes from some horror. But we're proud of the people that we came from. And I think that's a message that, almost anyone can profit from. So I would hope that this kind of story stays permanent, not just because of the particulars that we're talking about, the horrors of prejudice, but also because of the possibilities of family and what that can do. So I want to thank everyone that's been so involved.
Thank you, Mark. Very well said. Other family members or descendants of Herman Martius? All right. Well, with that, we'll turn to some of the questions in the chat. And I think that we have several of them.
Yes, we do, and a few Kipp already addressed, but I will bring us back to Howard asks, if from your research you found people of political left in Erie in this time period that were involved with groups like the Working Men's Circle, Russian Brotherhood, or other fraternal organizations.
I did not. I'll see Kipp or Claire. Did either of you?
I did not.
I also did not, but there were a lot of people on the left. So I don't want to speak for all of them.
Actually, if I can speak, I have a little bit of my research was about the fraternal organizations that existed in Western Pennsylvania, especially among the Jewish immigrant population. I did not see the groups that were mentioned in this question. One group that was highlighted specifically in Erie was this group called Kesher Shel Barzel, Chain of Iron, that was active there at the time. I don't have a lot of information about what this group did or what they organized around. Unfortunately, a very popular young adult author actually has a book titled Chain of Iron, so it is impossible on a very quick Google search to even find this information. Unfortunately, it seems it might have been, it might be a little bit harder of a dig to find exactly what exists at this time. We definitely know that fraternal organizations existed in Western Pennsylvania, especially among the Jewish immigrant community. Especially, I found a lot of groups that existed in Pittsburgh. But yeah, unfortunately, the groups that you mentioned, I did not find, but I'm sure existed.
I saw a reference to the Friends of Soviet Russia in the written part that was up there, which seemed to be a pretty big group in urban areas in the United States. We found working man circle cemeteries around Pittsburgh area that with Yiddish writing on the tombstones, and it seems to have been pretty big in the area. And this Russian Brotherhood, there's very little research that we found on it, but the Palmer raids cracked down on them extremely ruthlessly in Pittsburgh, Homestead, northern West Virginia, and other areas like that.
Well, I'll just thank you, Howard, and I'll just say that one thing that we hope the website will do is to inspire more research projects and for people perhaps in and around Erie to dig more into this story. And I'm hoping that will happen. And Kipp and I have been in touch with some folks in Erie that might continue the research. Mara, can you help us with, Kipp, did you want to say something? Mara, what is the next question?
Sure. So Kipp got to the explaining why folks like Kipp's grandfather were attracted to the Russian Revolution and not Zionism during the time. But Eileen was also wondering why such a large group of Jewish folks were attracted to Erie, of all places.
Zoe may know more about this than I, but my impression was that the reason that at least my grandparents were attracted to Erie had to do more with the community that was already there than with anything else. And I think that was something that existed around the United States, the Jewish immigrants and other immigrants from other places too, including from the Black migration from the South. People tended to go where there were established people from their own communities who spoke the same language and who had experiences with which others could identify. And I don't know why the first people from the Pale went to Erie, but they certainly laid the groundwork for a lot of others to follow. Zoe, do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I will just reiterate exactly what Kipp just said. Often in immigrant communities throughout history, once a community, some people immigrate to a certain location and community starts being formed, then you have people who are writing letters, or you heard through the grapevine, oh, this group of people from our community just immigrated to Erie and it seems like it's a safe community, so let's head towards that direction. And specifically the Jewish community in Erie, in the Reform Jewish community in Erie, which is Temple Anshe Hased's denomination, was one of the earliest Reform synagogues and established congregations. I'm pretty sure, I don't know the exact date off my head, but it's in the late 1800s. So the congregation was already established there. Immigrants had already gone over in a first wave, especially from the Pale settlement, Western Russia in the 1800s. And so it was the second wave that Kipp's family was a part of that was heading towards this location. So definitely what Kipp said, hearing from other people that this was an okay location to go to.
All right. So Mara, do you want me to scroll down and start taking these?
We've got one more from earlier. So Ron Schatz, who gave our last program, asked if you could compare the situation in 1922 and 2022. Ron has the impression that Donald Trump did very well in Erie County in his presidential campaign.
I don't know. I'm seeing that Al Hart is shaking his head no. Al is my expert on Erie along with Zoe. And I wonder, Al, if you have information about, or Zoe, if you have information about that would be able to respond to that question.
Biden won Erie County in 2020. Trump won it in 2016. Trump was the first Republican to win Erie County since Reagan in '84. NBC did a pretty good piece a month or two after the 2016 election. They interviewed a lot of working class voters. And it was interesting that people brought up the Clintons' connection to NAFTA as a reason that they voted for Trump. And they also resented the fact that Hillary Clinton never bothered to campaign in Erie, whereas Trump did and Bernie Sanders did.
Thank you. Well, it looks like our next question is, could any of the panelists talk about the attraction of the 1917 revolution? And were they hoping there would be a revolution here as well? Were they hoping to return back home? How active were socialists in Western Pennsylvania? I'll just quickly say that there were a lot of leftist groups in Western Pennsylvania in this time period. And of course, the crackdown that we've been talking about of the Palmer raids and other deportations and things would really, the Socialist Party of America declined rapidly. The industrial workers of the world declined. And the 1920s were a tough time for leftists, but Western Pennsylvania had a very active left, and then it would have resurgence later. But Kipp, do you want to take some of the other questions there?
Sure. And again, I think what we are presenting tonight is the beginning of a discussion rather than the end of one. And that's always the case when we're looking at history that has not yet really been fully uncovered. Hopefully, and I see the other panelists are all nodding with this, hopefully we're inspiring others to do the kind of research in the areas where you have questions and help others to do the same kind of thing. Kind of the opposite of what's being done in schools right now, where children are not getting that kind of inspiration as much as I wish they were, speaking as a retired teacher. But back to the questions themselves. All I know is from the stories that were passed down to me, and Joanna and Mark may have things to add too from their mothers, because among the three of us, all three of the offspring of that family are represented here. And some of my siblings are here too. They might have things to say. But what we learned and what my mother said to me, thank goodness I was able to tape record her talking about these things before she died. All three of the sisters died young. All three of them. None of them lived to be 70. And yet we are continuing the stories that they told us. My mother said to me, when she got to this point of discussing the Russian Revolution and her mom's response to it, she came to life in a really exciting way. My mom said to me, Russia, can you imagine people who were socialists who dreamed of a day that there might be a revolution that would change things. Didn't ever think it would start in Russia, but it did. And the excitement over such a deeply entrenched, horrific government, repressive government, being overthrown by people like us, what that she said about her mom's response was, it was just, it brought a new image into life that yes, it was possible to do that. And yes, to the question, do they want to see a revolution in the United States? Sure. Everywhere, if people could take over the reins of government into their own hands, that would be great. They didn't have much anticipation that it was going to happen soon anywhere else. But the idea that human beings were capable of getting rid of the kind of repression that had existed in Russia together was a very exciting one. As for going back to the place where the revolution had happened, I think I might have mentioned my grandmother told my mom that they did think about it, but they only thought about it very briefly because they felt that if it could happen in Russia, if people could get together and build solidarity that kind of way there, then they could do it anywhere. And they had made a home in the United States, and they wanted to do what they could to support others, short of making a revolution, all the way to a potential revolution, hopefully, here in the country that they had become their home. I think it's important for us to remember, too, that Lou Martin talked about this a little bit. There was a lot of organized social justice, radicalism, socialism in the United States. During World War I, lots of people went to jail for opposing the war itself. Eugene Victor Debs led a mass socialist party at that time, which was opposed to the war in the United States participation in World War I, and paid the price of going to jail. There were many different kinds of socialist organizations. The United Mine Workers had active members in the eastern part of Pennsylvania who were being imprisoned and killed as Molly Maguires fighting for their unions, people of all kinds of different backgrounds. And what we saw in West Virginia, the coming together of people immigrants from many different countries who couldn't speak one another's languages, along with black people from the United States and white West Virginians in the big battles that were going on for miners' union in West Virginia. And by battles, we're talking also about battles that involved people being killed for standing together. There was a lot of that kind of momentum happening in the United States. And among many of those people, the idea that working people like them had gotten rid of the czarist government was an inspiration. So what happened, and I think just finally, the difference between then and now, that one of the things that we need to recognize, and I'm sure all of us here do, as Zoe was talking about, this country is polarized now. It was polarized then, it's polarized now. There is a growing, armed, vicious right wing in this country. We can't deny that. It looks a little different than the one that existed in 1922, but many of the methods are the same. On our side, we are hopefully beginning to be more coming together around the issues that are confronting us smack in the face every day. And one of them has to be solidarity with the victims of this racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic violence that is rearing its head again. And Zoe gives me so much hope in the future, the way that she can talk about her generation and how people that she is working with are taking on that task.
Thanks, Kipp. We have a question from Anna. Is that what you were going to say, Mara?
Yeah, go ahead.
Anna asks, you mentioned Emma Goldman. Was there an anarchist presence in Erie at that time? And did any socialist authors or literature come out of the area that you know of? Kipp?
I am ignorant about that and look forward to other people discovering the answers to those things.
Yeah, I know we've got a couple experts if anybody wants to throw an answer in the chat. All right, so there must have been industries that attracted workers to Erie. What was the state of the labor movement in Erie at that time? To what extent did the IWW and the Socialist Party and the fledgling Communist Party have a presence there? Do we want to throw this one to Alan Hart as well?
I don't know. You know, my research into this was done 30 years ago when I worked at GE myself, and I met a much older man who had been at GE during the 1918 strike. He was Italian. His father was an immigrant from Italy. He was an apprentice and was therefore not part of any union. But he joined the strike anyway because his father was an Italian socialist and basically taught him that's what you're supposed to do. And he had also been arrested as a teenager in downtown Erie for handing out flyers advertising an appearance in Erie by Big Bill Haywood, which the police suppressed. So there was radicalism there. David Montgomery wrote about the 1918 strike in his great book, what is it called? Well, I'm forgetting the name right now. The Fall of the House of Labor, about basically labor in the AFL period and how by the 20s it was sort of on its in a depressed state. And he says the people that organized the strike at GE were revolutionary syndicalists, but they weren't wobblies. They were in the IAM and they were in the IBEW, and they were trying to start an industrial union of all electrical industry workers, which of course UE was in the 30s. So, but I don't know more than that. I know the Socialist Party exists. I didn't know they had a weekly paper. But I haven't studied the whole area and period and know more than that.
Thanks, Alan. And I'll just put in a plug for Ron Schatz's book, Electrical Workers, since he's on in our meeting as well. Another question here is, did Herman Martius have any relationship with the UMWA? If so, what? Kipp?
Yeah. All I know is that my mother was told by her mother that among the things that they were most focused on was building solidarity with the miners. I knew, of course, about the Battle of Blair Mountain being something that they would have been aware of and the struggles in West Virginia. But I'm still learning more frequently about how miners right here in Western Pennsylvania were also on strike at the time that he was killed. And I know that among the things that miners always looked to others for support with was money to be able to feed their families and find shelter when they went on strike. I think a lot of you know this, but most coal miners in those days and for many years after that too, lived in homes that were company homes. They lived around the coal mine, and they were completely dependent on the company allowing them to live in the shelters that they had, and on the company store for their provisions. And if they went on strike, they knew what that could mean, and very often did, and was meaning in Western Pennsylvania at that time. And that is that they would be, I would say, out on the street, except there weren't really streets in the mining camps. They would be without a place for their children to lay their heads at night, and without food. So the solidarity that came from other places was absolutely essential. And my grandparents, never dreaming, I don't think, that they would have an offspring who would be working in the mines, were motivated instead just by basic human solidarity and one of the things that the Friends of Soviet Russia did was, in addition to raising funds to help people who were starving in the new Soviet Union get food, was to help people around them who were struggling to build unions or for whatever reason being repressed to find the kind of support that they needed. So I do not know of any direct relationship between Herman Martius and the United Mine Workers, but I certainly am full of stories about the indirect solidarity that was given to miners.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, it's just like I think the United Mine Workers have a support fund right now for striking miners in Alabama, and this is something that Kipp and I talked about, these parallels that Herman and Beatrice were raising money for a famine in Ukraine at this time 100 years ago, and we could go on with the number of parallels. Philomena asked if students are learning this kind of history or only if they take my classes. I'll say that my goal is really to give students the tools to find the history that inspires them. That's what I try to do. And I hope that's what other history courses are doing. And Charlie McAllister had his hand up. Charlie, do you want to say something?
Yeah. Am I okay? I'm on. Yeah, I couldn't get on the chat. So, but there's a very important, I think, link to the 1922-23 strike for union. The UMW contract was up in 1922, and they suffered a vicious attack. I mean, they had during World War I had really expanded greatly and controlled a large amount of the mines in central Pennsylvania, in particular in the West, as well as the anthracite. But in 22-23, John Brophy in central Pennsylvania, when Lewis called a strike to protect, they were under attack, they were under all kinds of concessions. Lewis called a strike, but he called it off after he got basically the same contract or minor cuts for the union. Brophy, meanwhile, had gone out and organized dozens, if not hundreds, of non-union mines in central Pennsylvania, promising them that the union would support them in their struggle as well. Lewis completely was opposed to that, and Brophy then every union miner in central Pennsylvania gave $1 out of every paycheck to help pay for the non-union miners, and that non-union strike lasted well into 1923. And we're going to commemorate. There were several major things. One was in Windber. We got a state historical marker commemorating the 1922-23 strike. We're going to do that on Mitchell Day, April 1st next year. We'll mark the centennial of that struggle, a bitter struggle. And Windber was the Berwind White coal company that provided the power to the New York City subway. And there were all kinds of investigations sent out from New York City to investigate why they weren't getting the power and the coal that they needed from central Pennsylvania. And the second thing was in the story of Lilly in 1923, where the Klan in central Pennsylvania was anti-immigrant and anti-union. There were very few black folks there. And in 1923, 2 trainloads full of Klansmen in 3-piece suits came up from Altoona into Lilly, a little mining town, where a owner had the temerity to hire a Slav as a foreman. And in response to that, hundreds of Klansmen came up on the train, robed at when they got off the train, they all got in their Klan robes, marched through town, burnt a cross above the town that a local person had set up for them. But when they came back through, the miners started out with fruit and slop jars, and then it turned into stones, and then it was a gunfight. At least 2 were killed and 30 wounded. And there's a memorial in Lilly, the high mark of the Klan, the high water mark of the Klan, 1923, which they claim was the beginning of the decline of the Klan, was the stand of immigrant miners in 1923 in Lilly, Pennsylvania. So we're going to be commemorating both those events. We're going to go to Windber and to Lilly. join us on Mitchell Day, April 1st next year, and we will have we'll hopefully go to the Slovak Club like we did the last time, and we'll have a lot of miners from central Pennsylvania, a lot of memories of John Brophy, who was a very, very interesting union leader who very much believed in labor education, made that central.
Mayor Marley, but while
Go ahead, Charlie. Did you?
Yeah, that was the only other thing was LODZ. Is that where your family came from? Lodz, you said it?
Yes, and I learned that it's pronounced Lodge.
It's Woods, yeah, Woods. But I was there for a plant closings. I was sent by Pittsburgh City Council to represent Pittsburgh to Woods, and it was the textile center of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Huge factories. Tragically, we were pushed out of the center of the city where we were supposed to have this conference out into some stupid resort thing that I hated. But that place was a center of textile industry, and you got to remember that Łódź today is an absolute central Poland. The Russian zone when Poland disappeared from the face of the earth for 123 years, from 1790s to 1921. That eastern zone was Russia, and Łódź was part of it, but it was not Russia. It was almost totally Polish town in that period, and it was under Russian control, but not up until World War I, with the collapse of the Russian Tsarist regime. That's when obviously Poland fought for their own independence, fought the Reds and the Germans to establish an independent Poland in 1921.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for this important history, especially the history of the miners and your preservation work in that event next year. And Millie, I'm sorry we're not going to get to your question. I wanted to go to Kipp to see if you wanted to wrap us up before we turn it over to John.
Well, I just want to say that I think that the discussion really tonight shows two things to me really strongly. One is that that we who care about people whose names don't make the history books, who are among those people who are down here on the bottom, who want ourselves and our children and everyone to know real stories about what's really going on in the world. We have a lot of power to do that. And there's a need for that. And the term that I've learned recently that's in vogue now of history from below and people's history, it's absolutely essential. I'm nervous, angry about what's going on with the attempts to quash that kind of history. I think that this is something that we all need to be aware of. Someone asked the question whether people outside of Lou Martin's classrooms learn any of this history. As a teacher who went through the beginnings of what's going on now even more ferociously to quash that kind of teaching, I think it's something that we need to be aware of. What's called critical race theory. Today's newspaper in Pittsburgh has an article about how Grove City College has now come out vehemently cleansing themselves of any vestiges of critical race theory, so that they can be okay in the eyes of those who are attacking real education and banning books. This is a big challenge to us, a big challenge. And I think that I'm glad that we are gathered here today in honor of championing and defending and preserving and exploring the history that we need to have. I want to thank Charlie McAllister very much for exemplifying the kind of approach to history that we absolutely need, because if there's ever going to be any change for the better in this country, and there has been in the past, and there must be in the future, it's going to come from people who are armed by knowing that people like them made those changes in the past. And I want to thank the Battle of Homestead Foundation for its consistent, ongoing, growing work to preserve and bring out and encourage others to get involved in making and preserving this kind of history. I also think that it would be that what Lou Martin did in bringing together in presenting a class to students at Chatham University in which people like Zoe and Claire could, as they have said, find things that inspire them and help them become the leaders that they are becoming. That is absolutely, that's something that we need to leave here knowing is going on. What Zoe told us that she's involved in Oberlin, represents the hope for the future, in my opinion. And I think we can leave here knowing both that there are big attacks going on the things on the people who need to be defended, but also on the processes that make this kind of discussion happen and make the future possible. And we can come together knowing that there are also people like Claire and Zoe who are taking the struggle forward, and that we can take heart in offering ourselves in solidarity and in support of them. I really want to thank my cousins, Mark and Joanna. The last time we were in a room together, I can't even remember. But it's an honor and pleasure to be a part of your family, and also my siblings who are gathered here quietly, for being able to join in on this rather amazing event. And the appeals for funding for the Battle of Homestead Foundation, I hope that people are taking them seriously, because this is a place where we can have this kind of gathering and encourage the kind of work that we can take inspiration from now. So a tip of the hat.
John, are you able to wrap us up?
I can wrap us up really quick, I hope, but there's a few things I want to mention to everyone here. Just first, my thanks to you, Lou, and to Kipp, and to Zoe and Claire. Thanks a lot for Tess for being our chief engineer, and thanks a lot for Maura to getting the questions together. And I just want to invite those of you that might have an interest in pursuing these lines of people's history and trying to build the future from understanding the past. Why don't you join us? We have every other week we have Zoom breakfasts, and our next one is coming up May the 25th at 9:30. You don't have to be a member to participate. And what you'll hear is an informal discussion of what's going on locally, more discussion about what the programs that we're planning to do are coming up, and also current events. And I think you'll find you'll like the people talking, because they'll speak from the perspective of understanding that a lot of the important work is done by the people that we often don't read about in the history books or in the newspapers. And there's a lot of discussion of local organizing, and also discussion about what we can do to build more education in our schools, labor education, and to build the solidarity in our community organizations. So you're welcome to attend. Just go to you can go to our website, the Battle of Homestead website, and there you can enroll in getting our information, and you can also tell us at Battle of Homestead at battleofhomestead.org. You can tell us that you would like to come to the breakfast, and we'll send you the Zoom. Connection to do so. Also, our next program next month is going to. It's been alluded to, and it's going to highlight the mine workers that did sponsor the action in the anthracite fields, And I'm going to ask Mara, who's organizing that program, to tell us a little bit more about that program, which will be happening on the
Thursday, June 23rd.
Thursday, June 23rd. Can you tell us a little bit about the program, Mara?
Sure. So same time, same place. We'll be doing it over Zoom. And I'll be speaking with Mitchell Troutman, author of the book, The Bootleg Coal Rebellion, The Pennsylvania Miners Who Seized an Industry, 1925 to 1942.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think a lot of the strands that we picked up tonight will be continued in that discussion. I just want to say that our program in July is going to be a breakfast program on July 6th, which will be the 77th anniversary of the more than that. How many? The anniversary of the battle? Somebody do the math of the Battle of Homestead that happened on
130.
130. Thank you. There you go. We're going to have an informal discussion and talk more about the Battle of Homestead. What are those seeds of hope that have inspired us to continue? And you're invited to attend. It will be one of our first in-person events in 3 years. And it's going to happen at the Pump House in Homestead. You'll see more about that on our website. So everybody, thank you so much. I think we have more people tonight than we've ever had in our programs. And we really, really appreciate the time and effort that Lou and Kipp and our other guests are here. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all again, we hope. And let's keep in mind the solidarity that we're learning about and how we can practice it every day. Thank you very much.